Welcome to day 89. We've got Judges chapter 8, Psalm 42, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And chapter 15 is a long one. So let's start with Judges. The Ephraim tribe was offended that Gideon did not invite them to come along to the battle. And as I was reading this, I was just thinking, the Bible is really about real people. Sometimes we think that the Bible is the instruction book for life here on earth, and that the people in the Bible have their acts together. They're holy people, they're saints. But we see here that the Bible's full of real people, warts and all. Here we've got a petty little argument. Ephraim doesn't even know what Gideon was doing with God. Ephraim doesn't know, the tribe of Ephraim, that God told Gideon not to take a ton of people into battle. But, they were offended. They had a chat. They worked it out. They went along in their merry way. But just remember, sometimes reading the Bible is to help us feel better that we don't have our act together, that our lives are messy, that we're struggling with petty conflicts or big conflicts in our lives. And so sometimes this is just showing us the way to, confront things and deal with it and be able to move on. Overall, the theme is a sense of community, of how do we live together in faithfulness to God. We are not on this journey alone. Not only are we walking with God, but God has given us companions in our journey here on earth, and we get to walk with other believers. But sometimes it's messy, and sometimes we have petty arguments. After all the battles were done, Gideon was offered leadership over the Israelites, similar to a kingship. And he said no, and he said he was going to leave God in charge. Remember, this is the period of the judges. Gideon is listed as one of the judges. Deborah was a judge. We'll read about a couple more judges here in just a moment. But this was not a period of kings. Israelites had leaders. Often they were patriarchs, the men of the family, the head of the household, and then these judges were set aside. They were often tempted to have a king like everyone around them had kings. We have to be like the neighbors. But the one thing that Gideon did here that was not great was he took a little bit of gold from everyone, that, some of the gold that they had looted, and he ended up melting it down and making a little thing of gold. And eventually both Gideon and the Israelites around him started worshiping this little piece of gold. Now, their hearts may have also still been connected to God, but they still found comfort of some sort in worshiping this little gold piece. And I think this is, again, something for us to reflect on. What is it that turns our attention away from God? Where do we place our trust? Where do we place our loyalty? Where do we give our time? A lot of us say we don't have time for church every week. We don't have time to be serving other people and volunteering. But we all have the same number of minutes and hours and days of the week. We all are making a choice of how we use our minutes and hours and days each week. And are we setting aside part of our time for God so that God stays the focal point in our life, so we stay faithful and loyal to God and not put our trust and hope in something else in our lives? Psalm 42 speaks to this in a certain way. It speaks of the desire for God in the psalmist's lives, but it also describes periods of loneliness and despair, and points out the times that sometimes other people make fun of God because it's like, yeah, I don't see your God helping you out here. When's your God done something for you lately? The psalmist has questions for God, but it is clear that the psalmist still has hope and trust and faith that God is by them, knows what's going on, and will someday deliver them. Now we get to the long chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians. We're coming up to the end of the letter to the church in Corinth that Paul wrote. And this is a long chapter because Paul is really going deep onto what is the resurrection. What does it mean? What is going on with it? There are clearly questions in the community about what is the resurrection? What does a resurrected body look like? What all is going on here? Paul makes it very clear that this goes back to his earliest preaching as a follower of Jesus, that Jesus died and was raised from the dead for our sins. And this is the core belief of Christianity. Paul points out how Jesus showed himself to many after his resurrection. Paul was the last one to see him because Paul points out with humility that he had spent years persecuting the believers and trying to destroy the early church. But that in the end, God gave Paul work and God gave Paul energy for doing God's work and sharing the news about Jesus with other people. I love this line where Paul points out that Jesus was really a corpse. He was really dead. Because there are questions like, did Jesus really die? Or was he just like almost dead and he just came back? You know, these days we do know of people that were seemingly dead, but then figured out some way to come back. We have spy movies that have, you know, some sort of potion that the spies drink, and then 3 days later they pop up out of the coffin and go along their merry way. But what they're talking about here is Paul is reassuring people that Jesus really died and was really resurrected from the dead. He also ties this back to the origin stories of the Jewish faith, that death came from Adam's unfaithfulness and that life comes from Jesus' faithfulness. Paul also points out that he risks death on a daily basis in order to tell other people about Jesus. So one of the reflections I have for today is, what are we willing to risk in our lives for God? Are we willing to risk a tough conversation with someone? Are we willing to risk putting something out there that might be used against us? Are we willing to risk doing something in such a way that we might face prison? These are tough questions, and each of us has a different calling from God, and each of our work for God is going to look different. So there's no one answer to this. But I think, especially with some of the changes that are happening right now in the United States and around the world, I think there's a growing risk of lawsuits or even time in jail because of some of the work that Christians do. I love this part that Paul is really pointing out that resurrection is transformation. He uses a metaphor of planting a dead seed and then having a flourishing plant come up. The plant looks nothing like the seed. So he knows this is a weak metaphor, but he's pointing out we don't really know what the resurrected body looks like because we haven't been resurrected yet. And it's probably going to be a transformative experience, just like the seed transforms into this amazing plant. Our life before resurrection is not going to look like our life after resurrection. So he really challenges us to try and accept the transformation that Jesus Christ offers us, both in our life here on earth from the moment we believe, but also after our death through resurrection. Once again, going back to the Adam stuff, he talks about the first man, Adam, being a son of earth, and the second man, Jesus, being a son of heaven. And that we really need to be embracing our heavenly side as we accept the grace of Jesus in our life. For when I talk to people and people tell me their faith story and growing up in different families and different church experiences, there's a lot of people that bring up guilt and a sense of guilt that they got from their time in different churches. And Paul is really clear that Jesus erases sin, guilt, and death. We do not have to worry about these things anymore. Jesus has taken care of it. Our work for Jesus is worth the effort. So this is Paul's long sermon on the resurrection and the power that Jesus brings of transformation to our lives. And I think that is a power that is as relevant to us today as to the people in Corinth that Paul is writing to. And I think we really need to be thinking about what seeds are we planting for Jesus to be able to water and bring transformative growth to? What transformations are we willing to accept in our own lives? And what is the work that we are called to do and are willing to take the time to do for Jesus? We will see you next time. Have a super day.